Welcome to Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. I am Carolyn Freeman, and today I am chatting with Professor Elaine Kasket about the digital afterlife. Elaine is a cyberpsychologist and chartered counselling psychologist. She is an expert on technology's role within work, individual psychology, and relationships. She is also a keynote speaker and transformational coach, and she is a visiting professor at the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath. Welcome, Elaine. I'm so delighted to have you on board.
I'm very happy to be on board. I can't wait for our discussion today.
So, Elaine, before we get chatting about the work you do, can you tell me a little more about who you are and what that pivot point was that sent you down the road of cyberpsychology?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think I had a fairly conventional psychology training, although I did combine it with journalism in undergraduate. So I was always interested in writing as well and sort of writing about psychology. And I was, I did things psychologists do. I was working in the NHS, so I started my private practice. But it was fairly soon after I got my doctorate and that I logged on to this new site that everyone was speaking about. Which at the time was Facebook, so that gives it a date. It was around 2005. And at that point, Facebook didn't feature any sort of memorialization or didn't have any particular specific policy for what happened if somebody had an account on the site and they were to pass away. So I was looking around on Facebook and adding people and exploring things. And in the course of doing that, I just discovered one of these things that happened before memorialization, which was an in memory of group that somebody had created, because you can create, of course, all sorts of groups. And I was really interested in this as somebody who'd always been interested in death a little bit from a research perspective, because I had a related topic in my doctoral research. And so I thought, what's going on here? And I was looking at how people were talking and interacting and behaving on the memorial group, what they posted, what they did. But then I thought, I wonder if this young woman, because it was a young woman who had passed away, had a Facebook profile herself in life. And at that time, people were much less conscious of privacy settings. So I was able to go and explore what was happening there too. And I got very interested. And I ended up applying for ethical clearance to do a formal study, and ended up taking it to a conference and then editing a journal that was all about digital afterlife stuff. And so I was kind of away at that point. And so that was a super specific branch of cyberpsychology. Although, you know what? I don't think I called it that at the time. I didn't think, I'm doing a cyberpsychology thing. I just thought I was saying, I'm doing a thanatechnological thing, thana meaning death, thanatechnology, death tech, the digital afterlife space. But I didn't think cyberpsychology. I think it was really only when I was studying that a lot, the digital afterlife stuff, and it expanded out into lots of other areas of our life and how psychology and technology intersect, that I started calling myself that, joined the cyberpsychology section of the BPS when it was established as a section, which it wasn't until I think I'm right in saying 2018. And yeah, so it was kind of really only once that horizon expanded a little bit where I kind of thought almost after the fact, oh gosh, I think I've now earned the right to define myself as a cyberpsychologist. But I think it happens that way for a lot of us in this particular field. You may become a psychologist first on purpose, and then a cyberpsychologist by accident, or through experience, or through these kinds of stumble upon type experiences that we have.
I think most of the cyberpsychologists that I've spoken to who've been in psychology for a long time have literally just stumbled. There's a point where something happened and they go down this road of cyberpsychology.
Yeah. Right. So for me, that was 2005. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's quite some time. 21 years.
Yeah, I know. And to have that expertise, or to have that, well, it wasn't expertise at the time, but it's expertise now, that very specific corner of cyberpsychology that has to do with grief and mourning and beyond that, just our kind of behaviors, I guess, or, online as it regards the digital dead. That was that very niche corner. But yeah, now I think it's expanded into AI, obviously, but technology at work, and our working lives and relationships, stuff to do that really overlaps with some of the digital death stuff. For example, the whole area of AI companions really overlaps with the new grief bots, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that are made possible through combining what we leave behind in data and artificial intelligence, specifically these large language models. So that's got a lot of overlap there. So yeah, I have lots of different overlapping circles in my particular Venn diagram, cyberpsychology portfolio. Yeah, I'm sure it is a familiar story in theme, if not in its specificity.
And you wrote a book called All the Ghosts in the Machine, where you explored digital traces and how they continue after death.
Yeah.
So what got you, led you into that specific thing and got you writing this book?
Well, gosh, it was because I went down this road and because I started getting out of my lane, because I think another thing that cyber psychologists do, I think we must be quite kind of curious, lateral thinking kind of people, because I think that we tend to go not just into the psychology and into the technology or cyber side of things, but then oftentimes treading into other fields as well. So I was really picking up all sorts of things, talking to lots of other types of academics and professionals and getting interested in the ethical aspects and legal and social and historical. And there were loads of different things. And I'd sort of amassed so much territory that I was exploring that really the only thing that made sense was for me to gather it all up. And at that time that I pitched All the Ghosts in the Machine to the person who's now my literary agent who helped me get the book into the world, it was still, I would say, well, certainly relatively to now, really niche. Do you know what I mean? Like it wasn't, I think there's so much interest in it now, but I think at the time that it was actually published in, 2019, I think, in the initial edition, it was still pretty weird, I'd say. And this was a book that was destined not just for academics, or not at all for academics, really. It's like a general nonfiction book, like the kind of thing that you might see on a table in a bookstore about just like some sort of interesting contemporary issue. And so I knew that it was so perfect or so useful, mortality, I mean, as a lens for understanding so much about our life in this time. So big themes that are so important, like the power that technology companies or for-profit companies have over our identities, our data, the whole stuff around cybersecurity, the way our information is linked to one another, the kinds of ways in which that information is traded and bought and sold, and why it's worth what it's worth and what gets done with it and all this kind of stuff like that. These are issues that cut across all of our lives, right? But I think that using let's use the example of what happens to our data when we die lens really helps you understand a lot of those territories a lot better. And that's one of the things that I wanted the book to do, to kind of use it as a lens. So it went so far beyond the kind of grief and mourning thing, which I think maybe sometimes people expect of me as a psychologist. So yeah, with that amount of different kinds of areas that I wanted to explore, a book was really the only option. And I'd read a book, I'd written a book for professional practitioners before, like How to Become a Counseling Psychologist. It was part of the whole Routledge series of how to become this and that and the other kind of psychologist. And I'd edited the kind of handbook of counseling psychology and written some chapters and loads of books and things like that. But yeah, deciding that you think, no, actually, I want to talk to everybody. I want to talk to the general public. I want to write a book that's for that audience is a really different proposition than academic writing like I'd done before. And publishers are quite understandably kind of shy, or they're careful with you, because I think that a lot of people in academic disciplines feel or that they can write a book for a general audience, and they don't quite realize just how much needs to change in order to find that voice. But I felt like I could do it, and luckily I found some people who thought and trusted me to try to do it as well. And I think that was as important as anything else, that move in terms of my career, that I think that so many people and so many different, areas of life benefit from a cyber psychological perspective, that I feel that ability to talk to the general public about it and translate cyber-psychological concepts is super important. I feel like every business, every startup, every, kind of like needs a cyber psychologist to help them out with something. So you got to be able to talk to those broader audiences. And I really feel like there's a lot of fantastic cyber psychology research that's kind of imprisoned. It's kind of entrapped in more academic books or journals, and it really needs to get out beyond that because it's so needed right now.
I agree. There's a lot of cyber psychology books out there that are academically focused or or so expensive that the general public can't afford it. And even
Absolutely.
as a student, you can't afford it. And then how do you translate that? And it's kind of very academically focused. And I agree, to write something that's more consumer focused is really difficult and really different type of writing from academic style writing.
Yeah, a lot of academics can probably do it. It's just that it's like getting media training, for example. Like you don't necessarily know how to do it until you figured out, oh, wait, okay, you just don't realize just how different it needs to be, like you were saying. But I wrote a subsequent book called Reset, Rethinking Your Digital World for a Happier Life. That's the paperback title. And that one has a Digital Afterlife chapter too. It's the very end, the Digital Afterlife chapter, and it starts with digital gestation because I was so conscious of how our identities or our public or social facing identities are constructed for us or started for us often before we even arrive, before we're born. And so I thought, this is really interesting. These are the two bookends of the modern human lifespan, as it were, in terms of our digital face. And so I kind of did a revamp of the Erik Erikson psychosocial model of the lifespan that everybody knows, and did a kind of techno-psychosocial one that ended with Digital Afterlife. So that one was much more broad, whereas All That Goes in the Machine was quite deep. But as much of the other stuff that I talked about in that book, all of which I found super interesting, I think the Digital Afterlife stuff, it just remains my thing. It remains my thing.
Yeah.
It's good to have a thing.
It's great to have a thing, exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things you spoke about right in the beginning is how when Facebook came online and we started using social media a lot, I don't think many of us really thought about what happens to our data when we die. And I agree with you. It's kind of,
or what happens to our data.
Or what happens to our data, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
But also I agree with you, now it's becoming a lot more forefront in kind of conversations and narratives because of grief bots and death bots and AI engagement. And there's a lot of media around it, which there wasn't necessarily before. And many people kind of assume, and this is what I assumed as well, and probably until I started thinking about it, assumed, is that my online data simply disappears when I die. And actually, it persists indefinitely. Why do you think we don't always recognize this reality?
I think that's a really existential thing, because I think that it's very hard for us to wrap our heads around the concept of non-being in the first place. So when it comes to thinking about our own deaths, the idea of your consciousness, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around the idea of not being conscious, of not being there, of not, because that's how we exist. That's how we experience things. And so it's like the hardest thought experiment in the world, right? And so I think that that's part of it, just the inability to contemplate that you're not there, kind of thing. I also think, well, that's the main thing, really, that I think because the other side of things is that oftentimes people assume that everything will be there and that people will be able to do what they want with it, or you can leave it to people, or you can ask people to manage it, that everything will stay, because they think, oh, it's like my physical stuff, like, oh, somebody will need to do something with my physical stuff. So I think that people either are laboring under the illusion that somehow there's some magic digital watermarking or blockchain thing that manages to disappear all your stuff because you're not there anymore. But if you really sit and think about it for more than 5 or 10 minutes, you realize that there's no mechanism for that. Well, not yet, and there certainly probably won't be for a while. Our information online is so distributed. The characteristics of digital material it's infinitely, replicable and scalable, and you can disseminate it, you can spread and beyond its original context and all that kind of stuff. It can stay identified with you. It can become de-identified and aggregated and used to train model, whatever. It can disappear into other bodies of data. But, there ain't any hauling it back, and I think that and when I wrote All the Ghosts in the Machine, probably a lot more people said to me then than say to me now, well, it doesn't matter, what happens to my data when I die, I'll be dead. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for anything. And I think it is kind of really hard to believe also for people to understand how their data, once they're gone, can have various kinds of impacts on other people or on situations, as practical as the closure of the estate, for example, but maybe some other ways too. So I feel like people have got a better sense of that now. I think that more people are aware that it doesn't just disappear when they go and that that's a problem. But they're not necessarily any the wiser about what to do about it.
Yeah. I wonder also if people just don't think about it at all. It's like, and we all feel we are mortal in some ways, unless we have an illness that we know we've got X amount of time left. We just kind of go, oh, whatever.
Yeah, well, exactly. If you look at the statistics in the UK or in the US or Canada or anywhere about what percentage of people make wills for their physical stuff, if you look at the data about who does that, how many do it, or when they do it, they might only be more likely to do it if they are ill, if they've had some sort of short, sharp shock where somebody that they know is in a situation where a will wasn't left, or they've been in that situation, or they just are getting on and they're getting their affairs in order. It's not always about death denial, right? It's this weird administrative task that is not a routine administrative task, and it's kind of hard to figure out where to start. And unlike the tax year or something, when you've got to get your return in, there's no date, a specific date by which somebody is saying, by this date, you have to get this done, or there's this penalty, like an MOT or the taxes, like I said. There isn't that. So I think that a lot of us, it's as much a horror of administration as it is of death for a lot of people. I think the fact that they don't make a will. Yeah. But, I think that people are also really not thinking about how, if they don't make some plans to do with their devices or their accounts, how much of modern life is administrated through those routes, and how difficult it might be with the perfectly understandable safety stuff and cybersecurity stuff that they have on those devices and accounts for somebody to sort that out for them after they're gone. Just thinking about how much you cannot do without your phone, or you cannot do without an online account, that's an indication of how much stuff might get really screwy if you haven't made a plan for it, if you're not there.
Also, I guess most people don't realize that they probably need to do a living will as well as a end of life will. And I guess this falls into it. You don't kind of think about the implications of what happens if, because we just think nothing's ever going to happen.
Well, exactly. Like a lot of people think, oh, yes, a will, but not very many people talk about the lasting powers of attorney for your medical stuff on one hand, and then there's another kind for your financial sort of stuff or your administrative sort of stuff. And I think, in some of your digital world, your digital life probably falls into the latter. But, they did a piece of research a few years ago. I think it was Queen Mary that was doing a piece of research with estate professionals, people who help people with this kind of stuff, and how they were feeling and how skilled they were feeling or how knowledgeable. And what the study indicated, the survey indicated, was that a lot of people, even in this area, they struggle because things move on really quickly. There's all sorts of different dimensions and realms. In the UK, we don't have super solid legislation on, oh, this is a digital executor and this is what that looks like and this is their power. It's like we haven't really got there yet. So there's a lot of befuddlement. Mm-hmm.
So what actually happens to our online data and our accounts and our identities online when we die?
Well, they're going to stay by default unless you do something, and unless somebody does something, and they won't necessarily have the ability or the power to do something. So, if there's got to be the mechanism of informing whatever app or service or account or whatever that the person is dead. And for that, whoever's taking care of it has to know about everything. And let's say that person, let's say you get only notifications and things about your bank or statements or whatever else. You've disabled paper notifications because you want to save the trees. Right. And so everything's on the phone. And let's say your phone is all locked down and biometrically, whatever, and you haven't identified a legacy contact for your Apple phone, or you haven't, nobody else knows the password. Think about how hard it's going to be for somebody to even figure out what you've got. I don't have British Airways statements coming to my house. It comes through on my phone. I don't have statements from my bank coming to my house. I've opted to have them on my phone. I don't have bills for my email accounts dropping through my letterbox. It happens on my phone. What if somebody can't see any of the even apps that I have on my phone? Believe me, if you gave my husband or my child a quiz about where does Elaine bank? With what airlines does Elaine have accounts with loads of air miles in? Where does Elaine keep her manuscripts or documents or her photography portfolio or whatever else? That would be, yeah. If those were GCSEs, my daughter would not be going to college, so it's just like, and that's the way it is, right? So first of all that data is there, and that data includes, as I just, implied, some of that data has got value. Like, it's actually got monetary value in a way that a UK court might recognize as being legally executable in a will, right? Oh, my best-selling novel that's in the cloud or whatever it is, your photographs. And so, but if first somebody has to know where they are or what they are, then there's got to be some kind of mechanism and process and protocol and rules for like going to those places, and they've got to know what they need to see to verify that the user is actually dead and to do something to the account. But usually the only thing that they can do to the account is close it down. They can't necessarily, depending on what we're talking about, give that person who's inquiring with a certificate and everything access. So there's often a lot of misunderstandings at this point, or a lot of disappointments or confusion or even anger, because people are like, well, hold on a second. I'm the spouse. I'm the child. I'm the, next of kin. And for a lot of types of accounts and things, that won't matter. So you can see the different levels of issue.
Absolutely. It's quite complicated, actually. And there's lots of things we just don't consider. And you're right, is that a lot of the stuff comes through on our phone, our bank accounts, or actually not even a bank account, comes through on our emails. And if someone doesn't have access to another person's phone, if they don't know what the password is, or can't do the facial identity or the fingerprint identity, how do you actually get access to what they have? And how do you know what they do or don't have?
Mm-hmm.
If it comes through in the post box, you can go, oh, there's shares, or there's this is a check coming through from someone. You just don't know.
Yeah, the hanging file folders with all the statements and things like that. But how many of us have turned off those statements, I mean, you might get something out, you might be able to find clues, but and let's face it, this was always a bit of a scavenger hunt for a lot of people anyway. It's not like, the halcyon days of paper records when you could find everything. Oftentimes it was quite overwhelming for people who were taking care of these things still. But then you've got this portion now that's kind of locked behind. And if you do have passwords, or you are logging in, or you are essentially impersonating the person, the uncomfortable fact is you're breaking the law. So basically people are being drawn into what's fundamentally, like, technically defined as illegal activity just to take care of business. But this is the invidious position in which a lot of people are put. And, some of the big companies, in fact, some of the big companies who are perhaps most interested in hanging on to people's data, deceased or otherwise, if you're a big company, a big tech company, most of those companies have some kind of process, protocol. There's ways of finding out what to do, how to notify them or whatever. There's a place on the websites that you can go and find out how to do that. But for everyone that's like that, there's loads of other things that don't have that well-defined process or don't have the resources to support it. The people, the people power to support it.
And so talk about these technology companies, and they effectively control our digital remains and who we are. What kind of power do you think they hold over, let's call them the digitally dead, those who have died and their digital persona still on, all their information's online? And kind of what kind of ethical responsibilities should tech companies have towards families who are kind of dealing with the digital remains?
I think it's a really nice thought to think that for-profit companies like that have ethical responsibilities to us in these kinds of territories. And certainly I'm sure most of them would say that they feel that they do have that ethical responsibility. But the whole thing of like ethical charters and things like that, or kind of making arrangements for these kind of things based on ethics or ethics over profit, that's a very, I guess, optimistic expectation to have. So I guess our problem is that, unless they're, doing some sort of really demonstrable kind of like harm, it's really hard to get a big tech company to conform to some kind of ethical standard in this kind of psychological, emotional sort of like territory. But of course, it's not just psychological and emotional, it is practical in many ways. But what's been really interesting is to see how gradually over the years, these companies have gradually shifted to this position of default retention. So the whole delete upon death idea, because that's what Facebook used to have before 2007, a delete upon death policy. And some people have described that delete upon death policy as really horrible, like, oh, isn't that awful? I'm not so sure about that now, but by retaining it and by being the gatekeeper to it and being the kind of person sort of making decisions about it, it becomes amply clear that this is the control and the ownership that these companies had had all along. It's just that one doesn't realize it until, it's almost like by an account holder dying, you realize in a fuller way the huge amount of power that they had all the way along to dictate what happens. Yes, we'll release it. We won't release it. We'll, we'll do this, we'll do that. And when a user dies in most areas of the world, in most circumstances, they no longer have sort of a legal personality. Their interests are represented by the estate, but the estate might not necessarily have a say in what happens to digital remains or the contents of these accounts. And so the account holder is now out of contract. That contract doesn't pass to anybody else. And so in a way it frees, the party that, the kind of deceased person signed that contract with to do much more perhaps with that data than it could before, because you're dead and you're out of contract, and so that, that data can be used for all sorts of things, whether it's for training new models, whether it is for, which of course most companies do with impunity with the data they're living anyway, whether it is for kind of almost using the digitally dead as a conduit to garner insights about their still living users, because the dead stay in their social networks and you can infer various kinds of things about the living persons / consumers that are connected to these dead persons' accounts. They, they can use them or retain them as in social media land as incentives for living users to remain on platforms that they might have otherwise chosen to get rid of. I've certainly talked to people who don't really want to be on Facebook, for example, anymore. But back in the day when Facebook was like, more popular site amongst a lot of people before it basically just became what it is right now, which isn't so much of a very personal place anymore. There's a digital cemetery on there, and if you leave Facebook and really truly delete your account, you lock yourself out of a cemetery or a repository of relationships, memories of relationships that you had with people that were conducted on that platform or partially conducted on that platform. So that's just a handful of ways that companies might make use of your data. And that's just the companies, though. Or, they can sell email lists, or they can sell other sorts of data without necessarily stipulating who's dead and who's alive, if you see what I mean. So it's a weird kind of mining, it's just like oh well, yes. And now, as you saw in December, I think it was December 2025, it was in the new the patent came through for Meta, for a technology that would keep deceased users posting and commenting or participating on social media. And the patent was really weird because it basically framed the death of users as a user experience problem, like UX problem, like, oh, isn't it inconvenient or isn't it sort of disturbing to living users when deceased people disappear off the platform? So let's just kind of keep them going type of thing, which was fascinating. I'm not sure, so that's another thing, this kind of idea that, yes, we can continue to extract value or extract profit out of the deceased in various ways. And one of those ways is by just keeping them going to sort of try to kind of improve living users' experience of those spaces. So weird.
I'm slightly deeply disturbed by that. Because if
slightly
someone
deeply.
I knew, slightly deeply, because if someone I knew had died and they still post on Facebook, that would really, I don't know, I kind of feel almost like I can't express it, how awful it would make me feel.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people still engage with someone who's died on the basis that they will post about something and say, I really miss you, and tag that person as a way of almost talking to that person still.
Yeah.
And there are still memories that pop up on social media. But for someone to kind of, or that person who's died to keep posting is...
Yeah. I wrote about this in All the Ghosts in the Machine, because the way that this has happened historically, because we had online death for the social media age, and now we're sort of in death for the AI age, which is a very different phenomenon. But in sort of death in the social media age, what you had was kind of messages from beyond the grave, haunting type phenomena that were happening essentially courtesy of people who did know the passwords or who logged on. And so I gave an example of one woman who was in the news because I think it was her daughter had died, and she was still logged into her daughter's accounts. And then when her daughter's erstwhile boyfriend moved on with a new partner, she posted from within her daughter's account something to the effect of, don't you think it's a bit soon to be moving on, or something like that. And of course, since she was within her daughter's account, it appeared on the erstwhile boyfriend's page as a comment from his deceased ex-girlfriend. And so, you had people, or you had accounts that had gotten hacked, email accounts that are just sitting there unmonitored will almost eventually all become hacked. And then people would get spammed from within those accounts. Or there would be profile cloning type situations where somebody would clone the profile and then sort of refriend or attempt to refriend. So you get a friend requested from the dead. And so so most of the time, these things are courtesy of another person not a platform level feature. And Meta's patent was really interesting because that was like a platform feature that would just be perhaps visited upon the other users on the social media network. Whereas a similar Microsoft patent from a few years ago, 2021, I want to say, that came through, was much more about like, how an individual mourner can use technology to kind of assemble their own grief bot from, data that Microsoft held about a person. The initiative of that user, basically sort of saying, here's the suite of tools that you could use to do that on the initiative of the user. Meta's patent was different.
There seems to be quite a bit of that recreating someone through a grief bot going forward. And I'd love to chat about that in a second, but just going back to kind of the social media side of things, because once someone dies, there's almost like a kind of posthumous, yeah. Posthumous, thank you. Identity. So how do you think our personality kind of is reshaped after we die? And especially if people are engaging with that posthumous identity afterwards by tagging the person in or sending them messages after they've gone?
The thing is that identity is socially constructed. And this is one of the issues with when we say personality, yes, of course, a person has a personality or certain traits or characteristics that make them recognizable as them that do cut across context and settings and relationships. However, what's also the case is that every person that knows me knows a slightly different version of me because we're co-constructed together. Our dynamic is co-constructed. They have a different assessment, perhaps or description of my personality or experience of me than the next person, And so that's why anybody, like if you had 10 people and they all had unlimited, and they all had their own, data sets, I guess, or their own access to data of a person, and they made their own grief bot, you'd have 10 different grief bots. You would not have the same grief bot. So there's, so there's that. And I think there's almost a neurological correlate in that, when you have a relationship with someone, in your mind and your brain, you've got this person identity network, sort of like a neural cluster that represents that person and your relationship and your dynamic with them and your memories of them and your sensory information about them. And that person identity network is probably responsible for some of the sensory hallucination type events that so many bereaved people experience in terms of, feeling that the person is there, that they catch sight of them or whatever it is. And, there's lots of ways for this person identity network to be activated, or can come out in really vivid dreams or other kinds of things. And so I feel like just as we have a person identity network in here in our brains, we've also got that with respect to the digital remains that somebody leaves behind. And we've got our individual sense of that person. So when you say reshaped, and I think so that's always done on an individual basis when somebody's gone, we continue to evolve our account of that person or a feeling of that person or a relationship with that person over time, over the rest of our lives, if it was a really important person. Of course, that's also done in community, whereby, and it starts, right after a person dies, really. And some of the functions, as the great, emeritus professor at the University of Bath, Tony Walters, always pointed out, there's this negotiation in community of a durable biography of that person, where whether it's the eulogies at the funeral and the obituaries and the discussions everybody has, people sort of negotiate amongst themselves a kind of a comfortable, agreed upon sort of picture of the person going forward. Everybody will have their variations on it, but there's this kind of like consensus that maybe you arrive at. And semi-consensus that you might arrive at. So these reshapings always happen at an individual and a collective level. And so what's so interesting about the digital stuff is that, you've got it with these like materials, these raw materials, some of which are sort of centrally available or centrally held on social media, and some of which are only just available to people, like in more locally stored things. So I think it's not so much about a new reshaping or kind of or like reshaping the personality is new. That's very old. It's more about the available materials that we have to work with there that are so ample, and the number of kinds of things that we can do with them, which are also ample and exponentially increasing. And so all of the technologies to do with chatbots, video, audio, deep fakes, voice clones, all the technologies that enable us to do those things, we now have available to us in a relatively inexpensive and accessible way we can use the data of the dead for those things. And that's pretty, that's pretty new. That part's really new.
So what kind of role do you think these digital memories are? So if you've got a Facebook memory that comes up, or you've got all these photos on your computer that you stumble across, what kind of role do they play in the whole grieving process?
The grieving process is so idiosyncratic. It has various kinds of trajectories. Most of us are what might be termed resilient grievers, and that, yes, we love and we lose and we love and we lose and we go through and we deal with the finitude of, all life, etc. But that we, and this obviously has an impact, but we're resilient. And then there are various, sort of different other sort of trajectories, including people who get more stuck, not being really able to function or thrive in the way that they might otherwise function and thrive. And so there's no one grieving process. The stages of grief that most people know about they're not predictable or tidy or ordered in the way that people think that they are. So this seems to be people's number one question or concern in terms of how does such and such, fill in the blank with anything that you just asked me, or many other things as well, affect the grieving process. And I'm always really interested in that question because it implies, the idea that there is a process to, but everyone's bereavement process is probably as unique to that person and as the relationship was unique too. So that's the first thing to emphasize. And Morna O'Connor, Dr. Morna O'Connor, who did her doctoral research on this at Nottingham, she did such an interesting study that I was pleased to support her with while she was doing it, which was there were a number of people who had left behind digital remains. And she did long-term work where she interviewed people connected with this set of digital remains, for lack of a better phrase, over time. So soon after the person died, and then later on, and she found out from each of these people attached to that person, which of these digital remains are important to you? What role do they play in your life? Do you go to them? Do you look at them? Do you And so she did this multiple points, which is a amazing, very committed research design. And what she found was that it was different for everybody. And the ways that people described using, interacting, what they did with the digital remains, it was just so variable. It was so unique. And so I can't give you a summed up answer to that because it's not possible.
And as you say, everyone's so unique in how they do life and how they handle death, and it depends on your relationship with the person, and so many variables, not outside of just the personality and the way that you deal with stuff generally.
For every digital feature, possibility, event that might happen to do with a dead person, if for every person you find that hates that or is discomfited by that, you might find somebody for whom that's their absolute salvation. I think that what I am concerned with now, because we're talking about things where you're like, that happen on not bespoke, not specifically designed death tech spaces, but that are actually general kind of spaces, where death and where grief and mourning happen. Of course, there's a whole explosion, like there is with everything in AI, of digital afterlife, AI powered kinds of, grief bot type services these days. And I think that is, incredibly interesting and to me more troubling because there's a platformization of grief happening there. And by platformization, I mean a process of datification, commodification, algorithmic curation, and a nurturing of a kind of dependence or reliance. And of course, all under the umbrella of it being a business, and it being for profit. So I think that it is in the interest of such a business that is platformizing grief, commodifying it, sort of trying to figure out how to use the data of digital remains, commodifying these, curating them, and then kind of like getting people to rely on them so that they are their consumers, they're their clients. One of the things that benefits such a business is to pathologize grief or the experience of grief or the difficulties of that, which of course are many, and to offer a solution, a technological solution. And you can't really sort of talk in terms of a solution without problematizing something. And so grief is getting problematized. And so we have, and and I don't want the idea of grief as a pathology or a problem with a technological solution to be normalized. Nor would I like to see grieving people who are often very vulnerable, and who, it's a, kind of like, come on, big griefs are some of the, toughest times we ever endure as human beings. And to be targeted, I guess, at that point and offered services, that purport to heal us or help us or take pain away at those times. I've got a problem with that, as I would have with the problem of the platformization of all emotion. So this is another example of how we can use grief bots or other kinds of dedicated death tech services as an example of platformization of our inner lives in general. We can also talk in terms of platformization of our cognitive processes or other types of emotions or other kinds of inner things that were formerly not as accessible to capitalism. So that's
historically.
Yeah, exactly. Historically. I mean, no, mind you, yes, fine. I mean, some people say, oh, before this, it was therapy. It was the therapy industry that, platformized, our inner lives, or not, but that wasn't platformization, not then, because therapy was a practice, not a platform. Now we have things that are both practices and platforms. But yeah. So that's an example of what I'm talking about, how I think that the example of digital afterlives and death online or whatever as a lens for understanding a whole lot more about what's going on.
In terms of kind of grief bots and death bots, and it seems to me that there's two types of people who engage in grief bots or death bots. And the one is from the perspective of, if I want to remain immortal. So if I die, then someone's got something to engage with and my identity lives on. And the other side would be if someone I knew and loved died and I wanted to still engage with them. So to me, it's kind of two sides of the relationship, wanting that kind of digital platform and digital immortality. Why do you think that people want to engage in that kind of digital immortality?
Yeah, really interesting. And for this, I also refer people to the work of Dr. Deborah Bassett, who did her doctorate at the University of Warwick and who now does a lot of consulting in the digital afterlife space. She's a sociologist. Because she did a bit of a taxonomy of different types, so like people who create things versus people, for themselves, versus people who take these materials and like do something with it. So she kind of did a kind of rundown of these different types of things that's really useful. Yeah, it's really interesting. It because we have all sorts of people, again, popular and perhaps controversial out there in the world, and interestingly in the manosphere and in Silicon Valley and places like that, you get a lot of biohackers and various kinds, like long lifer kind of immortalists, or people who are really interested in, at the very least, downloading themselves somehow, or like uploading themselves right there. Yeah, transhumanism, which also kind of like in the kind of West Coast of the United States, there's a kind of enclave of this kind of stuff, but I'm sure in other places as well. And I think there's a particular, there's a particular sort of person perhaps who is really fascinated by that idea of kind of being able to continue. And, and I could, I'm sure that everybody who thinks in those terms, has their own individual psychological kind of like formulation. There may be some themes there, and I wouldn't want to make any generalizations about what drives people in that direction. But I think that definitely for some people, like Elon Musk, for example, was one of the people who was really interested in the kind of whole Neuralink thing. And he's talked about it for a lot of different applications and use cases, but at least one of them, at least originally, was this kind of immortal, living forever, kind of being able to upload yourself, etc. So I think that, sometimes it is about power. Sometimes it's about the kind of last frontier kind of fascination, which I think has a kind of a foundery startup, kind of like, kind of somebody who's really enthusiastic about technology and what technology can do, and the kind of like finding a solution for the insoluble, or the kind of like, who says that, death is certain, like what if it weren't, so I think there's that kind of like challenge, like that challenge kind of to be the one who cracks the code kind of thing, also maybe about power, but I think there's a certain amount of intellectual curiosity as well. And then I'm sure for some people, although it might not show in their personality or in their public facing kind of persona, there's probably a lot of, horror and fear and anxiety and kind of like a terror of kind of loss of control or power or whatever. And, there will be a lot of reasons, I'm sure, for each individual why that's there. But I think that there's far more of and I think that also sometimes some of these services, businesses and companies trade on this. And I talked about the kind of vulnerability of the grieving, but I also am thinking about the kind of targeting the vulnerability of people who are anticipating their own deaths, or who have children, or they've had, they are really scared of the idea of not being there anymore for people, or not being present in people's lives. And so sometimes you get these kinds of like let's make sure that we store you and we can send messages, at your daughter's wedding, or like the whole Safe Beyond, adverts from a few years ago, where, get the messages like, get the message and she's there in her wedding veil and she's like, oh, it's dad, this kind of stuff. So for some people, it really just gets them, the idea that they might not be able to be there for key moments. And, so that's another class of people, I think, that are interested in creating something before death. But you're absolutely right. It's a whole different set of things when you're talking about that kind of, here's one I made earlier type of grief bot. It's so interesting, though, because it requires you to accept some kind of premise that you understand, as the person making the grief bot, what the eventual mourners are going to want and need or be comfortable with. And that is not predictable. That is not predictable. One of my, I don't know, I wish I can't even find this blog now. I feel like I found it online at some point, or it was an article, or it was a magazine piece or something like that. Don't know what it was. It was a long time ago. And, but the piece, it had like 6 or 7 photographs of objects. And they were weird objects. There was a set of false teeth, or some kind of like dental plate, or there was like a sort of weird rock, and there was this, and there was that, these like funny things. And then there was a little essay beneath it saying, this is this object that is my most precious object of this person that I lost, and I always carry it with me, and this is why I have it. In each of those cases, the person who died would have not been able to predict that would be the object. No idea. They were so bizarre. It reminds me a little bit about the Museum of Lost Relationships in Zagreb, or Museum of Broken Relationships. That's the one where there's just like these bizarre, objects that people have saved at that kind of loss that the person wouldn't have been able to predict. we can't predict what people are going to want and need, because that grieving is going to be so idiosyncratic. So that's another challenge to the creation of a grief bot your own grief bot ahead of time. But then again, but people who construct them afterwards, and this is really big now. I was, again, pleased to be involved with this as well. I don't know if you saw, but recently, the last couple of weeks or a few weeks ago, on EastEnders, there was a grief bot storyline. And it was one of the first times that I've seen, and I was really, and they were very keen to get it right, And it was one of the first times that I am aware of where it was just featured like a everyday, because EastEnders is a very kind of everyday people grappling with stuff that's really going on. It's not really far-fetched scenarios. It's really down to earth kinds of things, but they tackle, tough stuff, but they tackle real stuff that's real in people's lives. And in that storyline, a well-meaning grandson, created a grief bot of his grieving grandpa's son, thinking that this would help him, and basically sprung it on him in the assumption that this would really help. Very, very believable, plausible thing that happens, And then he had this reaction to it. And then, and he kind of went through this journey with it. And the fact that a grief bot storyline was on EastEnders really tells you something about where we're at with these technologies now, because not very long ago, it really only would have been at home on Black Mirror and shows like that.
And there seems to be quite a few people who are starting to create those grief bots. And I'm guessing it's not just when someone dies. It's kind of like you were talking about earlier, if a relationship ends, to create a bot of a relationship that you haven't been ready to let go of, and to still be able to engage with that person feels a little bit like you're not dealing with it. It just kind of prolongs the grieving process, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. It's happening with all sorts of different relationships. I was just interviewed by a journalist that I work with frequently the other day, having to do with women creating kind of AI, like families, or kind of like, and it's very difficult to find a platform that will let you create an AI sort of like child. But like women who had lost children, who then kind of created an AI husband to be able to talk about the child, and they sort of like generate pictures of this child as though the child hadn't died, and so this is what I mean about, the pathologization of difficult emotion, and then the kind of experiential avoidance that people not just kind of instinctively engage with sometimes, because I think that, Freud talked about how, the kind of hedonism, as it were, the kind of like, kind of avoidance of pain that we can do. And I think this is what I mean by experiential avoidance. And people will try to work around difficulty often if they can. And then these platforms may sell us that. They may sell the avoidance of pain, just like the pharmaceutical industry sells the avoidance, like pain is bad, the pain is bad, This is one of the ways, by the way, this is such a tangent. This is such a kind of like a strange lateral thing. But I remember I come from the kind of Ohio, Kentucky kind of region in the United States originally, which is that corridor that, where OxyContin and fentanyl, all that kind of stuff just ravaged that area. And I read several, well-known books, some of which have been turned into series and stuff about what happened there with the pharmaceutical company behind it. But it kind of rooted it all in this kind of like narrative about how no amount of pain, nobody should have to endure any pain. That pain is bad, and it's to be eliminated. And if your pain is not controlled, if your pain is not fully controlled, well, then you need more stuff to make sure your pain is fully controlled, because it's almost like your birthright to not have to live with any sort of pain. And so that was the kind of philosophy or the sales pitch on the back of which all of those hardcore, ultimately fatal for so many pharmaceuticals were allowed to proliferate, and why they were justified. And I feel like this is obviously a very different scenario. I can't begin to compare it to the kind of like physical danger, the sort of thing of that. However, on a philosophical or kind of a conceptual sort of level, you see the similarity. Because what we're gradually being sold through this like techno-solutionism is a kind of, blanket experiential avoidance based on the idea that you shouldn't have to experience any aversive emotion. And here's the solution to it. So, why not just make it, why not just help you with your grief, but why not create the illusion that you never lost the person to begin with? That we can basically organize it so that they don't leave. Nobody leaves. Like you say, the breakup, the baby doesn't die, the girlfriend doesn't break up with you, the person doesn't pass away.
I personally find this quite extraordinary because there's the counter side of it where especially educationists are talking about resilience and grit. How do you teach children resilience and grit? And in my head, that is how you help them learn resilience and grit, is to deal with pain and manage it and know that you can get up again, because it's that falling down and getting up that teaches you can keep going, you can do it, it is okay. And that's part of the whole lived experience of life. So to kind of hold on to something or someone rather than deal with the reality and the emotions and the pain means that you never quite become resilient, that you never quite manage that grit that is about living, and that is the joy and the colors that are part of life, really.
Resilience is not rigid. Resilience involves flexibility. It involves psychological flexibility. What experiential avoidance does, or what kind of avoiding any kind of like difficulty does, and not learning what you've just mentioned, that renders us psychologically brittle. You've heard the physical analogy of the idea that these like apparently immovable, strong, tall buildings look like they're, completely solid, but to be constructed in a way so that they don't basically fall down or blow over, they have to have flexibility built into them. Like trees have to be able to bend in the wind. If we're too rigid, if we can only be okay if things are okay, then we are rendered incredibly psychologically brittle. And I think that is what, and this again overlaps with the AI companion space as well, with a lot of people resorting to AI companions who will not only never leave, but who will be sycophantic, who, you won't have any conflict, who won't have to figure it out, it won't have to be hard, all those kinds of things. Those render us relationally brittle and experientially avoidant in relationships. So that if people, especially young people, only experience the absolute kowtowing and you're so great and everything like that of an AI companion, they're not going to have any sort of idea about how to navigate the cut and thrust and ups and downs of actual messy human-to-human relationships. And so again, here, the same principle applies, but in a very different set of circumstances, and all revolving around the question of what happens when technological solutions are too much of a good thing. And this is why, although UX designers don't think in these terms, user experience designers don't think in these terms, I feel like the UX perspective and the cyberpsychological perspective are really different, because it's like, with UX, it's all about smoothing out pain points, or like, where's the user going to find it hard? Like, basically how can we make everything as great as possible, for the user, or how do we not freak the user out or send them into the uncanny valley by the fact that this voice team's robotic, let's make it breathe, so that everybody feels more comfortable, whatever. So that might be a UX perspective that sounds like a great idea. But I think from a cyber-psychological perspective, I'm a very big fan of what you'd call appropriate friction, where, I happen to think that the capacity to discern quite easily between what a human that you're dealing with and a machine that you're dealing with needs to be retained. I don't believe in the utility or usefulness or the necessity of making chatbots breathe or making them indistinguishable from humans. I feel like that's going down an extremely bad road. So I feel like but what I think of as appropriate friction and what a founder, developer, UX designer thinks of as appropriate friction may be very different things.
Because it is about psychologically, or giving us the psychological tools to actually do life. and do it well, and real life, not just digital life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And don't get me wrong. I mean, there's lots of digital spaces and tools and digitally mediated encounters and all those kinds of things that can be very important for living that real life. And to be honest, we've been worried and freaked out for a long time about, oh gosh, social media and how, kind of connections with other humans and like all this kind of stuff. I think, with the social media era, for all of its faults, and they are ample and they are many, the good thing about them is that they were facilitating human to human interaction. And so now
point.
that feels like a really great idea compared to like a lot of what we're, it was just, and if it weren't for the freaking algorithms and the very extractive nature of the economic models around those social media networks, that was more the problem with that. Not that the problem was not using technology to connect humans. The problem is the business model, is the economics of it, is the mechanisms of profit. That's the problem with it. It's not the actual technology that connecting the humans. That's fine. That's fine. That's good. At certain points in history, it was really good. What would have happened to us actually if social distancing and physical distancing had been the same during the pandemic? We might have been physically I was physically distanced in the pandemic. I was not socially distanced because I had a lot of social stuff. I basically got everything that I could get, that I could squeeze out of my technologically mediated interactions, so with other humans, so now I feel like this is, so to me, this is a dystopia worth paying attention to, that we are stepping into right now. And the problem is that everybody's kind of like racing headlong into this with a kind of AI everything kind of situation. I'm talking about business, type, kind of startups and things like that.
But also as individuals, we're racing into this with eyes wide open, but actually completely closed.
Yes, I know we're racing into it, but as consumers, rather than we're kind of, we're consumers. We're being, we're being aggressively marketed and sold these things, but it's not so hard to opt in because it's becoming extremely difficult to opt out. Like if you're using an email platform, how do you opt out of AI? Like if we're on a call, how do you opt out of AI? They're making it like they're putting in more steps to opt out of it. And so that most people don't read terms and conditions. Most people are like, oh, and then you kind of, it's so ambient everywhere in the environment. You exhaust yourself trying to move through life, trying to notice all the ambient things and take some sort of proactive effort to think about it and turn it off or whatever it is. It's just like nobody should have to expend that kind of effort. So it's essentially being integrated, without our explicit consent in all of our entire environment. So I think we're racing into it, yes, but we're just sort of we're not. There's not an equal amount of power here. There's not an equal amount of power, and consent has kind of gone out the window, I think, really, over the last few years with these kinds of things. And again, this is why I think it's so important that we as cyberpsychologists have a really active, proactive role, and a role that involves not staying in our, they use the analogy of the ivory tower of academia, academic journals, of course, all of that's very important. It's extremely important that we base what we're talking about in sound, critical, well-designed research. It's very important. However, then you need to take that understanding and that knowledge and you need to take it out into the world. And you need to have enough of us who are translating this in all the places it needs to be translated. Our profession is extraordinarily important now, hugely. And, and anybody that listens to your podcast that is thinking about a career in psychology or a move in psychology, please, God, yes, go for it. I just the ranks need to fill.
Absolutely, and especially in the digital realm, especially. So we spoke about kind of having a digital identity, and earlier on about having kind of cleaning our house, really. How do you think people can go about cleaning their house? What kind of practical steps could they take in managing the digital legacy? And especially thinking about the afterlife and people who are left behind, and kind of conversations we should probably be having with family members or those we've appointed as executors of our state, or a living will or digital will. What kind of practical steps can people start putting into place?
I mean, I think there needs to be a Swedish death cleaning book for the kind of digital stuff, really, because I think, think about how many stuff, think about how bogged down we all are by accounts that we don't use anymore, that stuff that we downloaded and used, but then we didn't, whatever. It just, so I think so much of this is about, if not, oh God, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because it's very hard to practice digital minimalism when the digital world is being thrust upon us the whole time. Digital minimalism almost kind of means kind of putting yourself in a disadvantaged position a lot of the time. So that's really hard. But I think, I think we definitely, if I knew that I had a limited amount of time, of course, I don't know. I could have a limited amount of, but if I knew that for sure, one of the things I'd definitely be doing is deleting all sorts of stuff, just getting rid of stuff, simplifying things down, now periodically, I really clear out all sorts of different things and apps, and I consolidate things, and I put things in a, password keeper, because even though I don't want to put anybody in a legal situation, in some situations, I keep on hoping that there's going to be some sort of legal thing that happens in the UK where your digital executor can have access to something in order to so I kind of try to keep those things consolidated for sure. So part of it is organization. Part of it is being really careful about what you accumulate in the first place, being very judicious about hold on a second, let me not just do this, unthinkingly, or let me not opt into all the things, or let me really think about what I'm allowing to track or to accumulate or whatever it is here. So try to be judicious about that in the first place. That's just, I suppose, good practice. Do that occasional cleaning house, because we're kind of hoarders, really, digital wise. If our digital stuff were physical stuff, we'd all be on extreme hoarders, And so those occasional real sort of clear out, when you do your spring cleaning of your house, do a spring cleaning of your computer, your phone, or whatever. But, but as life goes on and as your life simplifies, be gathering, consolidating. Maybe you take certain things offline. Maybe what I do occasionally, because of course I have thousands of photos, occasionally for really important things, or to kind of sum up the last couple of years, I will do just a good old fashioned old kind of photo book or something, because how is your kid or how is your grandkid going to have access to your social media accounts or whatever? They might not. Do you know what I mean? So I like to kind of almost take a bit of a curatorial opportunity every once in a while, because let's face it, all that stuff ain't going to be important. Do you know what I mean? And I'm also very concerned about it in terms of environmentally, because the data of the dead is mounting up on the world's servers as it stands. It's already bad enough, mind you, without artificially intelligently animating them all. It's the carbon footprint of the dead is already pretty extraordinary, right? And all full of just nothing, meaningless, completely irrelevant anything data anymore. And so in a way, I almost kind of see it as act of environmental care, to also just as fully as possible delete those things that I don't need. And I don't know. I don't have control over whether it actually gets deleted off of those company servers, but I exercise what control I can. So I think be careful what you accumulate in the first place. Do the occasional clear out that you can. If if you live in a jurisdiction where there is some kind of digital executor role or whatever it is, find out more about that. It never hurts to state your wishes, even if you don't know if they'll be legally enforceable or if anybody will pay attention. It never hurts to state your wishes in, documents like a will. For those platforms that allow planning of these kinds of things, and that includes Meta, and that includes Apple, and that includes Google, legacy contacts, inactive account managers, or whatever, use the settings that you are available to use. For anything monetarily really significant, for places where intellectual property is stored, or if you have 600,000 miles or Avios points on whatever it is, or if you have cryptocurrency or like Bitcoin wallets and things like that, the things that actually have kind of value, if something's password protected, double identity verification, triple identifier verification, don't assume that anybody else is going to be able to get into that. Assume they won't. Assume they won't. Assume they won't. Don't assume anything.
Yeah.
Don't assume anything. Investigate it, figure it out, plan for it. Don't make any assumptions. There's a very high chance that what you are assuming is not the case. That the digital stuff does not follow the same rules, the same laws, the same conventions, the same processes as physical, tangible, valuable stuff.
Someone said to me relatively recently, they spoke about a purple folder where you kind of keep all the stuff that someone would need to know if you had to die suddenly. So where do you find the will? How do you access bank accounts? Where are my passwords? How do you get into this? It's kind of giving them a folder that someone can actually understand what kind of digital stuff you have.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really good idea, and I haven't started it. I've been really rubbish. It's kind of like one of those things that I am getting to, but I thought that was quite a good idea. Do you think
it is a really good idea. Of course, anything time you do that, whether that is online, whether that's in a password keeper, whether that's offline, there's always security issues with that. Unless the person holding it is your legal executor, or has some sort of just like people online or on the dark web can find out that you've died and sort of wreak havoc or try to hack into stuff before the estate gets a chance to be settled. So too can somebody do some stuff, if they find a purple folder. It reminds me a little bit of some of the kind of folks. Sometimes they're of an older generation who keep their passwords and stuff in a notebook by their computer. But when we really think about it, for a lot of us, some of us might have some kind of version of that kind of approach. So it's sticky, isn't it? I mean, it just kind of reflects this conversation reflects the reality of the lack of control and the kind of that you can that your death means, and the fact that good planning is great, and good estate planning is fantastic, but we're in such weird, tangled, complicated territory with the digital stuff that kind of good estate planning it's really clear isn't possible in the same way. And you won't, whatever you do, you won't get it perfect, and you won't guarantee necessarily that things are going to pan out the way that you want. But let's just say the more you try and the more you think about it, the better off things will be. So if you can't do it all, do something.
So we've spoken a lot about the digital afterlife stuff that you focus on, and you're also visiting professor at the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath.
That's right.
There's two things I wanted to really find out from you. The one is what other areas of psychology you're involved in, because you do use some psychotherapy stuff as well. But also then, if someone was interested in your field of work or research that you're involved in, or interested in applying to the University of Bath, what would their next steps be? So if you can talk about this other stuff you're interested in, as well as if someone's interested in the
absolutely
kind of the digital afterlife, how do they go about?
Absolutely, for sure. Well, I mean, I am involved in other areas of psychology because in the UK, I'm a Health and Care Professions Council, HCPC registered counseling psychologist. Although I trained as a clinical psychologist in the United States, differences between the countries meant that I was registered as a counseling psychologist here, and I'm also, kind of with BPS and so forth. So I do that. I have a practice where I see clients, and I do that a few days a week. I also, a few years ago, decided that I practice a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy ACT in my psychological practice, and I'm also interested in ACC, acceptance and commitment coaching. I did decide to go ahead and get my International Coaching Federation, certifications and do some coaching qualification a few years back, because I was also interested in working in a bit more of an organizational context as well. So I do also some coaching mixed in within the psychotherapy. And one of the things I do as part of that is I have a bit of a emerging, I suppose, or kind of ongoing neurodivergence specialism, where I produced some neurodiversity resources for managers for one of the companies that I work for, kind of helping people not just understand what neurodiversity is, but how they can, I don't know, just be more inclusive managers for everybody on their team, no matter what their neurotype, and how they can be more flexible, I suppose, or maximally flexible and inclusive. So I really enjoy that. And I, and I do some lecturing here and there, now and again, still in the academic context, the occasional examination for somebody's Viva, especially if it comes in the cyberpsychology. I'm one of the people to call, I think, if somebody needs their PhD examined and it has a cyberpsychology kind of thing. Sometimes I get involved in examinations for people. I think that's part of an academic's, doing the Lord's work, as they say. And so now, because I have so many irons in the fire, and I like a lot of independence these days, I tend to have honorary professorships or visiting professorships rather than full-time academic posts. And so I was very honored last year to be appointed a visiting professor at the Center for Death and Society at the University of Bath. And the Center for Death and Society had its 20th year anniversary just last year. And that's a lot of different academics. They have a lot of fellowships. They've got some visiting professors like me. But it's like a sort of a research cluster, really. It's not the only one of its kind in the UK. There's a Center for kind of grief studies at Bristol. There's the Center for Death and Life Studies at Durham. So people who are interested in a kind of interdisciplinary kind of way or approach to thinking about death and death in society have a few different options here in the UK, Bath being one of them. And so there's a lot of really incredible academics with whom I've collaborated over the years. They have they have conferences, the CDAS conferences, which is one's coming up in I believe it's in Aarhus this year. Don't quote me on that, but they have them in different countries and stuff. They have the DDD conference, which is the death and dying and disposition conferences that are also multidisciplinary conferences. So no matter what your kind of field, if you're kind of interested in death within that field, there's probably somebody available at the Center for Death and Society who could supervise you in your postgraduate work. So if you're interested in taking that in an academic direction, I definitely encourage you to check out CDAS. Also, if you're doing a project, you're already enrolled somewhere where you're studying something, or you're somebody who's writing something, or a journalist, or whatever it is, there's lots of experts and loads of different kinds of death and society sorts of things at CDAS that you can get on their website, and you can probably find somebody who can tell you about anything from, kind of funerals to economics of death to different cultural sorts of things to, all politics, feminist takes, stuff to do with intersectionality. Really interesting, really interesting. So there's lots of folks there at the Center for Death and Society, some of whom I've known almost since 2006, 2007. Now some of them are my big buddies, to have these long, kind of friendships. Some of the people that you meet at death conferences, they're some of the nicest people. It's just really, really lovely group of scholars.
That sounds extraordinary. There's so many areas of death and dying, which I had absolutely no idea about because I just haven't been exposed to it. But now you talk about it, it's like there is so much around death and dying that we just don't think about until we're faced with it.
Absolutely. Like the last time I went to Bath, because I just kind of go to Bath every once in a while, and sometimes they have a CDAS day. Somebody usually gives a talk, and there was an academic there giving a talk about their research. He was a legal person originally, and he was doing his stuff around when homeless people die. That does and having to do with the kind of legalities and the processes and like what happens with the state and everything like that when somebody who's unhoused dies. And again, you just never. I mean, like, you just don't really think about some of these different angles and about some of the kind of political and social issues and things that might be packed into that, or even economic kinds of issues that might be packed into that. So yeah, have a look at the Center for Death and Society's website. They have a list of all the visiting fellows and the faculty and everything like that. And you'll see the really fascinating range of things to do with various death-related topics for study. And a lot of it, again, it ends up being sort of more important than you might imagine that it is.
So, Elaine, what's the most important question I haven't asked you yet?
I think an important question or an important topic that we haven't talked about, and that I think about a lot, is how do we stay hopeful or optimistic at this particular junction in history? Or maybe the more black and white closed question of is hope lost? Because I think a lot of people are feeling quite overwhelmed, and understandably, there's a lot going on in the world, and we're aware of a lot going on in the world because our whole context are all collapsed. Everything that happens all around the globe can feel very near in a way that it wouldn't have done always before the the internet. And you may think by saying that you haven't asked me this question that have got an answer for you that's all sort of tied up with a neat bow, and I don't. But I do. I think that, and I always believe, and I would not be a psychologist if I didn't believe that there is always hope for kind of change and evolution. And I think that we are going through a pretty important cycle in human history. And I think I do have hope, and that is because I think that we are coming to a point of not just reckoning, but correction. I think that in a way, with reference to developmental psychology, we have a sort of developmental arc with this technology that we're living with today, that we kind of have gone with, social media, and are probably now going through with AI, a kind of childlike amazement and wonder and naivete, and there's a playfulness and a kind of innocence about that. And then we get that kind of maybe not very useful, misdirected anger, flailing out kind of adolescent relationship with it and with the powers behind it, where we kind of get really reactive and kind of reductionist in our thinking, kind of push back and get upset and on protest and all this kind of stuff. And then hopefully we come to a more informed, grounded, mature, balanced, nuanced kind of adult position, with respect to these things. And it's from that position that maybe we can start to make some really important moves that we need to make. And when I say we, I mean, I guess collectively we as a society, because, it's been happening to me for the same amount of time that's been happening to you and everybody else, the kind of like acceleration of these kinds of technologies. So I have feelings like, I want us to get to that kind of like mature adult, kind of like nuanced, and part of that is slowed down kind of response to AI. We need to accelerate that a little bit. We can't take as long to get around to it as we did with social media, I think. But I think there is hope. I think that that's where the hope lies. And I think that we've got to hang on to that.
With that in mind, where do you see the future of cyberpsychology going in the realm of the digital afterlife?
Well, I mean, I think there's already a lot of people involved in this. They're not all psychologists. There's a lot of sociologists. There's a lot of legal professionals. There's so many disciplines, very, very interdisciplinary, fundamentally. It's very, very hard not to be an interdisciplinary person and be involved with digital afterlives. It involves very lateral connections all over the place. But I really would love more cyber psychologists to join me in looking at this particular corner of the cyberpsychology world, because it's really rich territory in the kind of density of its connections to lots of other types of psychology, lots of different types of psychological, relationships and sort of issues and all that kind of stuff. So there's just so many interesting connecting threads. And it's got a lot of fascinating kind of web of connections to other kinds of associated disciplines. So it's rich territory to be. So in terms of where it's going, I hope left, right, center, up, down, expanding in all the directions.
And it's so under-resourced in terms of cyberpsychologists, this area of cyberpsychology. There are psychologists who are interested in it for sure, but under-resourced, yeah, I would say so, because I would say that cyberpsychologists in general, like I said, a little while ago, they're so needed because they're needed in business, they're needed in government, they need to be involved in policy, they need to be involved in involving all sorts of different frameworks. They are needed, not just in this segment of it, but everywhere. So, Elaine, do you have any particular favorite cyberpsychology related books that you normally recommend others to read?
Well, the thing is, a lot of those books are really, they're very academic. They're the expensive, have you got 85 quid to spare kind of books, that I've mentioned. I think that, the kinds of books that I try to write, like Reset, like All That Goes to the Machine, like that general readership kind of book is, it's really rather rare, I think. It's either kind of the more kind of like poppy kind of like, so, and like sometimes people, in some ways, like some of like books like by already popular authors like Johann Hari and places like that, but like are almost in that territory, but he's not a psychologist, other people that whose name I don't even want to say are not psychologists. So I'm about to be in this like really ridiculous position of not being able to think of any books other than my own, which is not the kind of person I am. But it's one of the other questions. When I read books that are interesting to me, see, the thing is, I don't think it's necessarily any less useful. I mean, obviously, if you kind of got an idea where you're thinking, okay, let me think about this in terms of psychology, and you don't even have to be a psychologist to do this. I feel like you can almost take a cyberpsychology lens to lots of different kinds of things. Do you see what I mean? So it's like, I guess what I'd encourage people to do is when they sort of see different kind of phenomena happening, just to kind of like ask yourself, well, I wonder what the psychological take on this is, or I wonder if there's a cyberpsychological take on this, and then just look it up from there, and then see where that leads you. Because the thing is that any cyberpsychology book you have is not going to cover all the things, and I think that what I really want to encourage people to do is look for the cyberpsychological dimension in so much of what they encounter and follow their nose and their curiosity from there. And they will find the resources in the books and so forth that you can kind of deepen that from, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and my challenge is always cyberpsychologists. We need layman-facing books that are general for the general public, not just academics, because there's so few, as you say, so few that are easily readable, and those that are written by non-psychologists often.
Exactly, they're often written by non-psychologists, but they're referring to all sorts of and maybe sort of playing pretty fast and loose with the research as well, not being psychologists. And it's really interesting. One of the things that I've had to do, like for many years, my own website. I told somebody this the other day. I said, so for years, the status of my website was like at the beginning of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the character called Arthur Dent wakes up to find that his house is being knocked down or about to be knocked down. And he gets really mad at the government official or the council person who's overseeing it, Mr. Prosser. And Mr. Prosser's like, oh, well, the planning documents have been on public display for ages. And he was like, yeah, they were in a basement. They were in a locked filing cabinet and disused lavatory. And there was a sign on the door that said, beware the leopard. And that was was basically the findability of my website until recently. And I started working with a person who was expert in like search engine and, generative AI search engine optimization. And in service of getting my website actually visible to anyone who was looking for something, she said, okay, let's write all of these cyber psychology pieces that are like layman's things, that are basic things about doom scrolling or the psychology of social media or this or that or whatever, like sharenting, which is one of the other things I talk about, like parents sharing children's data, or what is cyber psychology, or grief bots and this and that. So basically like cyber psychology basics type pieces. And that's what we put on your website. And that's what we and so that's what I've been doing. And in that process, she tries to design a piece for me that has all the keywords in, but she's not a psychologist. So then I take this piece and I basically think, oh yeah, I've written all sorts of things about this, or I know about this. And then I try to preserve the SEO architecture whilst then basically putting my cyber psychology stamp all over it. And so there are those of us who are out there trying to, in that more bite-sized form, put some grounded, not just buzzwordy kind of AI kind of like stuff out there, but like actual stuff that people can metabolize. So I'm sure I'm not the only one doing that. I'm sure lots of other psychologists are too. So books are there and people should keep reading books, but they are also not the only game in town.
Exactly that. Brilliant. Elaine, thank you so much for joining me on Confessions of a Cyber Psychologist. It was fabulous to catch up with you, and I really look forward to catching up with you again in the future.
That would be lovely. I really had a good time chatting. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome.